Ladies and gentlemen, to deliver the lecture today, we have a very eminent gentleman, that's Mr. Nihal Rodrigo. Mr. Nihal Rodrigo is a Sri Lankan diplomat who served as the 6th Secretary General of the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation from January 1st, 1999 to January 10, 2002. He is one of the most outstanding diplomats of Sri Lanka, specializing on China and SAARC countries. He was one time the ambassador to Beijing as well as secretary to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Sri Lanka. After a short teaching spell in Trinity College, he had joined the Foreign Service. Mr. Rodrigo had 4 separate postings at the United Nations, 3 times in New York and once in Geneva, with concurrent accreditation to Vienna. So gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, I'll hand over to Mr. Nihal Rodrigo to deliver his lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those introductory words. I think I must first explain that there were 3 aspects of international affairs were given to me to speak earlier. They all have a major aspect of influence on local policies as well as economics as well. That was going to be the world politics, then the United Nations Charter, and the diaspora. And I've changed that slightly to make it diaspora. That is the 3rd aspect. I have replaced with an area which is of major importance, practical importance for Sri Lanka, rather than disarmament, which I can touch on, but it's a rather boring subject also, and it does not have such a big impact on Sri Lanka today. I think it is more important to look at what are the developments in the Indian Ocean region, because Sri Lanka is directly affected by what is happening in that region, and also because of our location, we also have a huge impact on the Indian Ocean itself. And those are aspects, I think, which I would like to present to you and see how it goes on. So if it's possible, what I'll do is, I don't want to bore you too much. So I will continue till about 6 o'clock and then give a break of about 10 minutes. And then after that we can come back and I'll see how this works out, and then leave about 15-20 minutes for question and answer. Now when you look at the first theme, of course one reason why I suggested getting to the Indian Ocean region is because it has so many aspects of foreign affairs, so many aspects of economics, so many aspects of human security. Like, for example, themes include cooperation, conflict, democracy, piracy, major crimes. All these are sort of affecting this Indian Ocean area. So let me start off first with the theme of international affairs and world politics. First, a little history. The sub-theme of colonialism, that is one of the sub-themes given to me. The World War II took place from 1939 to 1945. And it was basically a struggle between Germany and Italy versus almost all the other countries. And that includes US, UK, France, and so on. And they were all called the Allied Forces. Then Sri Lanka was still like India and Pakistan. Pakistan was not yet there, but it was a British colony. And when the Allies defeated Hitler, and there was some domestic issues also involved for the Allies, like the British and so on, which was ruling Sri Lanka. And one of these think tanks who study foreign affairs and so on have called it military and economic fatigue. That is, after all the fighting with the Germans and so on, their military is also like exhausted, people have died, and economic fatigue, their money and so on, their expenses and so on have all got more. So that of course helped Sri Lanka and India and all the independence movements, because the British and so on didn't have that much of power to be able to control countries including like Sri Lanka. And that certainly, it helped the independence movements for the colonies. So India and Pakistan were set up in 1947 and Sri Lanka in 1948. So the colonies that became independent, of course, they did keep good relations with the colonial powers. For example, the language of contacts. Now I am speaking to you in English also for that reason. It is because the SAARC countries and all the, that is of the countries of SAARC except for Nepal and Bhutan, all the others were British colonies. So that language is still helpful in keeping contacts between the South Asian countries, and that is a major factor in terms of economic cooperation, education and things like that. Then the superpowers really were also still in competition at that time. That's the people who defeated the Germans because, for example, there were ideological differences. That is between communism, that is like the Soviet Union, China and so on, and democracy. So this was then given a new term. It was called Great Power Conflict. That is big powers which were attacking each other and so on. And that went on for a very long time. It's not there so much now, and I will take that in the third lecture, because there is now cooperation between communist countries and democracy. And the best example is the rise of China. Now, China is a communist country and it has now become the second largest economy in the world. Japan was number 2, but China was able to beat them, and they are number 2. There's even some people who predict, that includes also groups like the World Bank, that maybe in the next 10 or 15 years, China's economy will be even stronger and will be number 1 economy, beating even the United States. But that goes on, and the divisions of course continued for quite a while, because for example even in 1966 it was there. I experienced it personally. I joined the Foreign Office of Third World Sri Lanka, which was then a democracy, and my first foreign posting was to Germany. Of course, at that time, that is even in the 1960s, Germany, there were 2 Germanys. There was the Federal Republic of Germany with the capital in Bonn, and the so-called German Democratic Party, which was not quite democratic, but it was more heavily communist. So my experience was between both these countries. I was really attached to Bonn, that is to West Germany, but at the same time there was some friendship developing between East Germany and West Germany, but a little bit of suspicion also. So just to give a rather interesting example, my wife and I, we had a Volkswagen, one of those bugs as I call it, and without going anywhere else during one vacation, I went to East Germany. And it was very interesting that when I was driving on that road, not the best of autobahns, but the road was still good, I found that behind me there was a Wartburg. A Wartburg is the car that was being made in East Germany, and the same guy was driving that car. So even when we stopped to have a meal or rest of it, that chap was also in the same hotel. So if I am sitting down with my wife, I could see the guy standing close by. So that was very interesting. And then what I did was in a what they call a Stadtmitte, that is the center of a town in Leipzig on the East German side, I was taking photographs, and Then I saw this guy was following me. So what I did was I went back like this and held my camera like this, pretending to take a picture of the architects of a building. And then I quickly turned and clicked. And I still have a photograph of this chap like this, pushing back and hiding. So that was a suspicion that was there. And much later when I asked some other diplomats, why are these fellows following a small country like Sri Lanka? And what he said was, it is simply this. Most of the third world delegates who are in Bonn, they spend their vacations or holidays in Paris and Vienna and all those nice cities. And I was the only guy, particularly from the third world, who decided to go to East Germany, which most of those people didn't like. So that was just to show you the differences that was existing even in 1966. Now, of course, you have a completely different situation because China is now a communist country, continues, but it is still the second largest economy in the world. And the US is the largest for now. So there are mixed economies. Like, for example, if you look at the only things that are working under in today's world, a strong communist and a strong Democrat, which are not cooperating, is of course the ideological division between the Republic of Korea, which is open, and that is known as South Korea, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea. Now these two are therefore sort of still attacking each other almost, and I was also attached to the DPRK because it was possible to go, not visit, but I was also covering the Korea, but that was from China. That's much later. I go back to that. Then, of course, interesting incident now that a film, you would have seen that in the newspapers and so on. A film was made by Sony, that's a Japanese TV and movie company, which was on Kim Jong-un, that is the dictator of North Korea. And that was trying to bring down the reputation of the North Koreans. And then the North Koreans were very angry about this because it was shown all over the place. And they started attacking even the Japanese because Sony was one of their things. That became quite a problem because even the Americans wanted to stop that because Americans also don't like North Korea. And because the US is still nervous about Kim because he is still having this model communist thing. And that has led now to a cyber warfare because what has happened is that the American internet and cyber things have started blocking all of Korea's internet, even cell phones. They don't have that many, but all that type of thing. So now that has become quite a problem, a security problem as well as a actual national problem as well. At the moment, I'm not sure what the situation is. But even in India, they have got DVDs of that movie, which makes fun of Kim Jong-il. And this is also to show that today, even the cyber aspects are very important. And we don't need arms and so on. Sometimes these can block things. And very often we find various internet complications where countries block each other's material and so on from that. Then at the same time, the ideological aspects are changing now. For example, the United States and Cuba relations, that is now changing a bit. And again, my personal experience when I was in China returning to New York, there was a long delay at the New York airport because I had also been in Cuba just before that. But of course, there the chaps at the immigration apologized to me and said, very sorry, we were not quite sure whether you were really Sri Lankan or whether you were actually could have been even a Korean, So because that type of things have been there. But what is interesting now is Cuba is also changing. And what is very interesting is that they are trying to establish a sort of a communist state, but not to be disliked. And I think what is interesting is that Pope Francis, the Catholic Pope now, he is the first Pope who is not from Europe. He is, I think, an Argentinian. Now he is the one, he is due to visit Sri Lanka, I think, next week. Now he, on his 78th birthday function, he also started working very closely, and at least what is very interesting is that I just access this from some websites. It is because of Pope Francis, he encouraged talks between United States and Cuba, because they did not recognize each other and so on. And finally, he managed to have a meeting sometime in October this year, and Obama, through a translator, had spoken to Fidel Castro on the phone. And it was a very interesting aspect of a close relationship that was developing on those lines. And there, later, Castro had said, why don't we open diplomatic relations again? And his exact words were, this is no way that the heart of the matter has been resolved. The economic, commercial, financial blockade on Cuba, which causes enormous human and economic damage to our country, must stop. But the progress made in our exchanges prove that it is possible to find a solution. So now that worked out quite well, and the statistics taken by the United States find that 6 out of 10 Americans support establishing relations with Cuba. There are still some people who are opposed to it. So this is a good example of how the cyber aspects and so on, and these differences in ideology can also be brought back quite well. So now it's rather interesting, and I think the current long-running conflicts are part of a subject which I thought I can discuss. Now, we have a situation also in Sri Lanka that when it comes to the election in a few days, we have a very interesting juxtaposition of the JVP, Communist Party, and the UNP in an alliance. So this nowadays, I think the ideological aspects are not that sort of strong if it can promote some sort of cooperation. And here again, I think according to the World Bank and ADB reports, there is now a possibility that China's communism will beat US democracy to become the world's most powerful economy probably in the next 20 years. So therefore, its cooperation rather than conflict is the answer. Now, for Sri Lanka, as I said, I won't go into details because this is not a domestic political issue. Elections here, a mix of different parties. It's not a straightforward UNP, SLSP type thing, but both sides have got communist parties and religious parties and all that type of thing. So this is a second theme which I will take when I discuss the whole charter and the UN system as such. Then beyond that, I think what I will do is get on to the next subject, which was, of course, on the whole question of the United Nations. Yeah, of course, here also it's interesting that the United Nations organization was set up in 1945 at the end of the World War II, that is 1939 to 1945. Now it is very similar to the League of Nations, which was also set up after World War I in 1920. And the League of Nations, of course, could not stop the Second World War, and why they failed has also provided very good lessons for the UN, and their UN Charter is extremely important. Now, I will read some parts of the Charter, but I think at the end of the lecture, I think I am supposed to give a sort of short summary. What I will do is I will give all the websites where these quotations and so on, you can easily access them and work that out. Now, for example, there are we started off in the UN with just 43 countries, and today there are 193 member states. That is also because more people got independent. And Lanka, for example, joined the United Nations only in 1955, although we received independence in 1948. And now the members are supposed to act and work on 6 major principles, and these are very important because that indicates also something like the whole theme and the whole operations of the United Nations. It says the organization is based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all its members, whether they are big or small. So between the US and Maldives, there is no problem. Both have the same rights in the UN. And the second point, all members, in order to ensure the rights and benefits from membership, shall in good faith work on the present charter. That is, all are supposed to work in terms of the UN Charter. Then the third one is all members shall settle their international disputes by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security are not endangered. Now that is of course not working because there are still particularly territorial differences where force is sometimes used. India and Pakistan have those problems. Then even Sri Lanka with Tamil Nadu and that whole aspect, those issues are there, but they are much less than before. Then of course, this aspect is also ignored. It says all members shall give the UN every assistance and refrain from assisting any state against which the US is taking action. That was an interesting one because some countries are not agreeing to some of the embargoes that are put on some countries. So the UN is authorized to intervene in matters, the UN is not authorized to intervene in matters within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. Now that is also rather interesting because, for example, on Sri Lanka, the UN has been interfering, but of course, because of the format of the UN, this has been also been able to be controlled. Now, just to give an example, when this whole question of investigations have been brought in to what happened during the war with LTT, we had, of course, one of our best diplomats, a colleague of mine, Mr. Palyakkara, who was then ambassador in New York as a UN ambassador. Now, he was able, because of his personal contacts, and that is one of the most important things in diplomacy, managed to get 3 resolutions which were adopted without anybody opposing them. First, in the Security Council, he got a resolution saying that the war is all over and now Sri Lanka is working for peaceful process. Then, in the UN General Assembly, he also got a similar statement, and also in the very important in the UN Human Rights Commission, saying that Sri Lanka is now independent. They fought a hard war with the terrorists, and everything is quiet. Now, at that time, the last days of the war were not described as it is being described today. That situation has changed partly because our ambassadors at the UN were not as skillful as Mr. Palyakkara in having personal relations with diplomats and even explaining things to them. And that's a very important thing in diplomacy, the whole question of the personal aspects. So these, of course, I think what I'll do is I give you the websites, then you can see what are the principles of the UN and so on. They are too long to be discussed. Then, of course, the other thing is that the United Nations General Assembly is for all members. In addition to that, there are really 4 major councils, each with a specialized type of activity. For example, the most important one is the Security Council. Now, this is interesting because this demonstrates the major importance that is still being given to just 5 countries. So there is inequality in that sense at the UN as well, although they say that all states are equal. And the 5 permanent members are all powerful members. For example, they are United States, United Kingdom, China, France, and Russia. And not only are they called permanent members, they do not have to be voted into power each year. Whereas all the others, they serve only for 2 years. And then there's an election for the next 2 years to pick their own thing. And of course, these 5 members have what is called the veto power, which is also very powerful. Any one of the 5 can stop a resolution that is in the Security Council. Now that, of course, has very good impact for Sri Lanka, because on the human rights issues, China and Russia have been supporting Sri Lanka and saying, don't interfere in the internal matters of Sri Lanka. They have fought terrorism and knocked it out, and you can't now blame them for what happened just after the war was over and the attacks that were placed also on the LTT. Now that is being highly politicized outside the UN, because we have large numbers of ethnic Tamils who were, of course, affected by the war, no doubt at all, but also others who go abroad saying that they are Tamils and we can't stay in Sri Lanka, they will kill us also, and get visas to stay. Now that is exploited, very interesting, by the countries in which they are employed. Now Canada, for example, has an area called Scarborough. There, lots of the immigrants who came there, saying that they are on the basis on saying that they are Tamils, were given. I knew some of those people when I was in New York, and one person came and explained how he was actually an electrician, and he said that he was given a contract for 1 year by the Canadian government, and the salary was fairly high in terms of translating into or changing it into Sri Lanka rupees. At the end of 1 year, he was summoned and told, do you want to stay? So obviously he had said, yes, I want to stay. Not because he was afraid of being killed, but because the salary, Canadian dollars, was sufficiently good to send some back and so on. But no increment was paid. So that way, the Canadians also exploited that by keeping those people working at a cheap rate just to give them the visa. So it is in fact called a vote bank. In Canada, particularly in Scarborough, I have been there, and it's very nice because there are tosekades, there are shops with DVDs with M.G. Ramachandran, all those things are there. And they all sort of are quite content, but they say that what they earn is adequate for them to stay. And then if they can prove it, the Canadians allow them to take citizenship as well and then get the vote for that. So that's a Security Council. Second big group in that is the Economic and Social Council. Now this, of course, there are about 54 members. They also are changed every 3 years. There is no permanent member, and these dealing mostly with economic and social issues. Then there is also the Trusteeship Council. Now the Trusteeship Council is now more or less finished. This is only where countries which are about to be made independent, they would work with this group till they become independent, but that's not very important now. Then in addition to that, I won't go into all the details. There's a whole lot of stuff you can get on the website. There's of course the International Court of Justice, which is any disputes between 2 countries, they see how that works out. And the UN has a whole lot of other things. If you look at the average, now this is the United Nations handbook, and you will find this, the number of different commissions and so on is enormous. But each has a very limited power, but I think it's rather important that they continue that way. And this way I think they managed to have a degree of specialization in the UN, and the people in those committees can help the countries concerned. Then I'll particularly go into a little bit of detail on the Human Rights Council, which is one of the things I mentioned. Now here, it is also an intergovernmental body, and it has a membership of 47 countries. 47 countries, they work it out on the geographic area. The largest number of people in that are, I think, the Asians, then the Africans and so on. But their thing is that this works very strictly. Now, if I can give some details on that, each member serves for, I think, 3 or 4 years. There are 13 members in the council of the 192 of the 47 members of the council. 13 members are from Africa. Then 13 members also from Asia, 6 from Eastern European group, 8 from Latin America and Caribbean, and only 7 from Western Europe. That is purely on the population aspect. But at the same time, the expectations of the members of the council are that they must be very tough on any human rights violations. And here, this becomes a very interesting thing. The difference between the Human Rights Council, which is in the UN, and what is called the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. The High Commissioner for Human Rights is the one who visits all the countries where there are allegations of human rights violations. And we had, of course, Nami Pillai coming to Sri Lanka. She was the Human Rights Commissioner, and that's the type of thing that they will work out on how this can be done with. And here too, the Council makes recommendations to the General Assembly and puts various strictures and what is called a universal review. It assesses a situation in all 192 countries. And here, of course, the problem is that, again, depending on the who visits your country, like Nami Pillai, she was, of course, herself a Tamil from South Africa, and she had a very strong feeling about discrimination on the Tamils and so on, so her things are slightly tougher than the others. Then apart from that, let me just concentrate on the resolution that is going to be, that was voted on in March of this year on Sri Lanka, and that is, action on that is currently under discussion. And here I'll just read out this thing, but you can easily access this on the website. It calls on the government of Sri Lanka to independent, credible investigation into allegations of violating human rights. And then these are the hard ones. They will hold accountable those responsible for such violations to end incidents on human rights violations in Sri Lanka. So that is very, very clear. Then it also says that calls on the government to implement the constructive recommendations made in respect of the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission. Now that is also a very important one. My friend Palyakara was also on it, and so also our legal advisor and the UN, Mr. Rohan Pereira. They are that over Sri Lanka, taking evidence from various people who have suffered under the conflict with the LTT. They were Sinhalese, Tamils, Muslims, but they went to any person who wanted to come before that committee could come. And it was a huge document that they brought up, but that too is sort of now partly fault of the government of Sri Lanka also, that they have not taken action on some of the more difficult recommendations made. For example, it says the government of Sri Lanka must investigate all attacks by individuals and groups on journalists, religious minority groups, and other members of civil society. Now that report is still there, but not much has been implemented, because every government studies it, but nothing really has been going on there. And this is what is really bad. The resolution notes the recommendations of the High Commissioner, that is Navi Pillai, on ongoing human rights violations and the need for an international inquiry machinery. That is not to have just a Sri Lankan one, but an international one, so that they can monitor the human rights situation in Sri Lanka and to undertake investigations into various attacks. It has not really been done, and there is some criticism of the Lessons Learned Committee, the LLRC as they call it, for not doing its work. But the resolution cannot really take this to Security Council by itself. So it will be discussed, and I'm not quite sure what is going to happen, because even people like, for example, the US Secretary of State, that's the equivalent of a foreign minister, it's very fairly balanced, I must say. It says, the resolution reaffirms the commitment of the international community to support the government of Sri Lanka as it pursues reconciliation and respect for human rights. So, at the same time, they say the Sri Lankan people are resilient, that is, they can fight anything that comes in. They have demonstrated grit, courage, and determination through years of war. Now they are demanding democracy and prosperity. They deserve that chance. That is just to say that particularly those who are affected by the conflict, which includes not merely Tamils, Muslims, Sinhalese, all those who have been involved, and that resolution is there, which is of course put purely by the Americans only. Then the White House press secretary, some of these statements that are made for votes and all that type of thing. He has, he's called the head of the National Security Council, that is in the President's office in the White House. He says, we agree with the resolution's request for the High Commissioner to investigate serious violations of human rights by both parties and to monitor human rights situation in Sri Lanka, which has continued to deteriorate. So they have bluntly said that human rights is deteriorating in Sri Lanka. And it says, today's resolution sends a message of concern about the present human rights situation and the denial of universal human rights. So it's also a fairly tough one from the United States, and that was issued in March this year. But this will be taken up as the human rights thing as it comes in as well. Then at this point I will sort of, it's only 5:50. I will just take some aspects going into too much of detail on the third aspect, which is much more complicated in terms of what are the issues involved and so on. So what I can suggest is that perhaps we can just take a 10-minute break, and then after that take the other more complicated issue, which is looking at the whole political situation globally, and seeing how Sri Lanka fits into what is going on globally as well, and how we are expected to cope with it, not purely on the human rights thing, but so many other matters. So I would like that to be called the Indian Ocean region, the third one, rather than disarmament. Disarmament is very, if you look at the Indian Ocean region, it is one of the most complicated regions in the whole world, because it has certain characteristics which are very tough, and I'll just give you some just some basic aspects about the Indian Ocean first, and then go into more detail after that, because it's, I think, the one that really affects Sri Lanka very firmly. What is important about the Indian Ocean region is that they have certain aspects, basic factors, which are going to be very important. And I think I can sort of talk of these when we have the later session. And mostly because, for example, for Sri Lanka, our neighborhood of South Asia, 5 of the 8 SAARC countries have borders on the Indian Ocean. That's very important. That is India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Maldives and Sri Lanka. Then the other 3 have no boundaries on the Indian Ocean. That is Afghanistan, Nepal and Bhutan. But even they are affected by what goes on in the within South Asia also. Despite our having SAARC, there are constant complications between India and Pakistan, Pakistan and Bangladesh. So those things go on, and I think particularly in the case of Pakistan, it has been pretty bad, because as you know, in the recent past, just about a week or 2 back, there was an attack by a very radical Islamic group, although Pakistan is majority Islamic, on a school in Peshawar, where most of the victims were school kids and who were small kids. Now that is something that even Pakistan is trying very hard to condemn. So there are a whole lot of issues internal to different countries. I won't go into too much of detail, but what I'll do is that when we come back, say at the 10 minutes or so, say at at 10 past 6, I will go into details of that. But in the meanwhile, if you have any questions on the first 2 issues that I took up, that is on world politics and the UN Charter, is there anyone likes to ask questions on that part? And then we can break for a little while. Yeah, any questions, sir? Okay, then we'll get back at 6:10, and then I'll go into the details of the Indian Ocean, because that's a very complicated one, and it's something which is affecting our life daily almost. Yeah, thank you. We can start off because everybody seems to be back again. So this particular issue, I think, is very important, the whole question of the Indian Ocean region, because if I did something on disarmament, it's all very theoretical, and now it doesn't affect individual countries as it did earlier. But looking at the Indian Ocean region, I will leave about 10 minutes at the end of it for questions, but if there's anyone who wants to get something cleared, even when I'm explaining something, and if there is some doubt, please feel free. We can certainly now basically, I think if you look at the whole question of the Indian Ocean region, there are some aspects which go back very much deep into the past, and I think they involve certain historical aspects as well, so I will touch on some of those. The basic thing is that the Indian Ocean region, as I told you, that all the SAARC countries, not all, 5 of the 8 SAARC countries are also in the Indian Ocean. So even the whole question of regional cooperation in SAARC is also affected by certain factors in the Indian Ocean. They are much more united, and they have achieved much more than SAARC has, because SAARC, even when it comes to some discussions on certain issues, sometimes the Indo-Pakistani problem might come up, or Bangladeshi problem might come up, and even also Sri Lanka, India, things like that all keep coming up. But it's very interesting that there is also a number of UN and independent groups which also deal with the Indian Ocean region. And one is the Indian Ocean Rim Association, which is a strategic and economic think tank which has been set up by the Western countries. Last year was held in Perth, Australia. Now, Australia is one of the few Indian Ocean countries which is technically European or white or whatever you call it, because the Indian Ocean region is largely of Asian countries, and this is one of the few countries that is closer to the Western world and closer to those approaches. Now, what is very important is that they had a research group that went into the whole question of the importance of the Indian Ocean region, and there are about 5 or 6 points which I've gathered from. This is that the Indian Ocean is a third, these are just characteristics of the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean is the third largest ocean in the world, that is in terms of its extent. I think the largest is the Pacific, and the Atlantic is number 2, I think, or the other way around. And secondly, that something like, though it is the third largest in terms of its size, the population that lives in the Indian Ocean is very high. It's 40% of the world population. So 40% of the world population is caught up in this regional area. Then the Indian Ocean region are also very great, despite it being one of the more poorer of the regions, because the Indian Ocean ports, and these are Colombo, Mumbai, Gwadar, Chittagong, all these ports, these handle something like 30% of all global trade. So this is a very important one. It's a point of transition for different countries in the world. Then the fourth point is that 60%, that is of all the sea. So that makes it a very important security aspect, and that whole area gets very sensitive to all these things. And something else which this group had merely assessed, but it was not exactly proven, that 40% of the world gas reserves are in the Indian Ocean. Now, gas reserves are much more difficult to access than, say, petroleum products and so on. But it is something that has not developed that much. But certain countries have a lot of gas that they collect from these things. So 40% is the assessment of the gas reserves that are in the Indian Ocean region. And then the one that is that the criminal elements, international cartels, are very, very strong in the Indian Ocean region. Now you have the United States also, you have the mafias that operate there. And there is rather interesting because the mafias are mostly Italian, but they are also working with other groups. So like that, these criminal aspects are very, very extensive in the Indian Ocean. And these are mostly the following are things. One is piracy. Now, although Somalia is an African country, a lot of their piracy and so on was also affecting Indian Ocean. So that is one of the major threats. Second one, and this is that it is across the Indian Ocean that the largest amount of people are smuggled across, that is breaking visas and so on. Partly also because Indian Ocean, in terms of the Indian Ocean countries, their economic aspects are not very good, and there are large numbers of people who are being smuggled across the Indian Ocean. And I think Sri Lanka also had a huge problem with this way, because there were people who were people smugglers, and at the start they were taking mostly Tamils, but then later it got to be such a very good business that it involved all sorts of people who wanted, but mostly in Australia. So that was a very major thing, where, for example, smugglers were not necessarily from Sri Lanka, although Sri Lanka is really in the dead center of the Indian Ocean almost. They were taking people from Bangladesh, from Pakistan, Sri Lanka, into Australia in particular. And these were the boats that were operated by criminal groups, and you can't put the blame on any one nation. there were even Europeans who were involved in this smuggling trade, and particularly those who were trying to go to Australia. Now there, fortunately, we had who is still ambassador. He's here on holiday, I think more than holiday. He's also here for the elections, through lobbying and so on. But he was also a former naval chief, and he had very good relations with the Australian navies, and they were able to stop some of the smuggling that was going on by these corporate international groups. They were not Sri Lankans or anything, Indians, Pakistanis, all people were involved in that. And it was a very lucrative business. And it was also very unfortunate, because most of the people who were smuggled were very poor. They gave all their life savings to pay the smuggler, and very often they were stopped. And Australians worked out an understanding with Papua New Guinea, where they had a huge refugee camp, where anyone who was caught there was kept there for a short time, and they made arrangements to find out what country they are from, who they are, and then send them back. So this has become a very interesting aspect of a criminal cartel. Then also criminal cartels are involved in drug trafficking, also across the Indian Ocean. Then gun running and other criminal activities. And here it's very interesting that the whole gun running equipment and all that was really perfected by the LTT. And they were able to arrange for these things to be worked out and get their arms to in China, for example, we were getting a lot of military aid from the Chinese, and it was very interesting that there too we had difficulties, because some of the ships that were bringing even arms to Sri Lanka were being attacked by LTT groups on the Indian Ocean. So they had also a very good naval encounters to bring all this stuff as well. So these aspects are very interesting, and this whole question of piracy, more the Somalis, according to the World Bank report, costs the global economy around $18 billion every year in getting these things done. There are central points because of this, and this would require us to go back into the past a little bit. Now, if you look at the island of Sri Lanka, it became a Portuguese colony through the use of armed force by the Portuguese Icarias, and there's a very good Lester James Peary's movie also called talks of the Portuguese Icaria and so on. So that was another aspect, that even as far back as 1505, there were these groups that were sort of operating. And then what is interesting is that even before who was part of the Chinese government at that time, he had visited Sri Lanka at least 5 times, and this has been historically proven. But his visits were not harmful. He was coming basically to push various economic and advantages for China. And this was 1 century before even the Portuguese were able to come to this area. So what is interesting about Zheng He is that he was basically using the oceans not for illegal things, but for legitimate transfer of things, and this included particularly China's most, at that time, the most material that they had, which was silk, and the other was porcelain. Now, today, again, I'll go into some detail. We have what is known as a new proposal, not a new proposal, but basically based on these old ones, called the 21st century Indian Ocean trade route. That is what the Chinese are having now, also to develop certain aspects, which is for their good security as well as for their trade and commerce. So that's a very interesting thing of how that past is working with us. And in that time, according to reports and also stories, short stories in people were also very snobbish. Now, here you sometimes call them sort of Columbo 7 people, or those people who are very much interested in this style and going for cocktail parties and that type of thing. And they loved to have their women wearing silk, and also to have food and dinners and so on served in Chinese porcelain, because those products were excellent. Now, if you look at porcelain, recently they discovered one of the ships of Chenghe, which had sunk, because Chenghe went in large groups of about 3-4 ships at one time, and it was discovered by some American Navy guys. The only things they found was something wrapped up in even a material they're not sure of, whether it is silk or anything else, or even rubber. And inside that were a whole series of porcelain plates. And when they cleared that, because it was wrapped up in several things, they were absolutely untouched. So even today, the Chinese talk of their porcelain as being excellent. It's not that it's not the major thing, but it's one of the things that they export. So this was very interesting, and this is what also made the whole question of the southern port of Gaul to be a vital stopping place for the sea routes. And if you look at it also, again, not being ethnic, but a lot of the Arabia and from the Middle East. So there was a large Muslim population that gathered at that time in Gaul, because that also illustrates the importance of Sri Lanka in terms of the Indian Ocean, because it's really at the dead center of the Indian Ocean if you look at it. So that was interesting, and this is something that is very important as a maritime halting place for Chinese ships that were going off to Europe, because they would go up, and there was no Suez Canal at that time, and then the rest of it they might do it by land or go right down under Africa and go across. That was but this was the shortest, quickest route, and that's, I think, a very interesting aspect that we can look at. Miller had also arrived on the east coast of America in 1421. Now this is very interesting, because currently when we did history and all that, the whole question was that Christopher Columbus was the first what they used to call them Red Indians and so on, people who lived in China, and that was really very interesting, that they were sort of really the guys who discovered it, because Christopher Columbus was also a Portuguese. There are these huge, very large ships, and that has been basically proved through an Australian researcher by the name of Gavin Hines, I think, yeah, where he has evidence to prove that before Christopher Columbus went to America, that it was the Chinese, Chenghe, who went there, and that there was some dealings taking place even there. Because at that time when America was discovered, most of the Europeans thought that this was another part of India, because the people are dark skin or red skins. So that entire civilization of the so-called redskins, as they are called, who had each of them so a whole lot of these groups which had their own individual civilizations, which are now totally destroyed by the Western countries, because they are all living in reservations. But there are, of course, some people who have got married to whites and they sort of mixed in. But this is another aspect of history, where again we can see that the so-called civilized Europeans, who claim that they are the most civilized group, had their very strong economic drive that led them to all these things that happened in this place. But most of the Western people do not accept the theory of Chenghe. People are going into research on that, and the evidence seems to be that he had actually been there. Then I mentioned earlier, the earlier lecture, that the two world wars that had taken place, and about the Second World War being over and great power rivalry developing. That is again between the Allies, the Soviet Union, and not so much the Chinese, but mostly the Soviet Union, and that's the communists and the capitalists from Europe and elsewhere. So this whole thing was there, and it was very interesting that there were efforts in the Indian Ocean to establish military bases and ports for trade. That was by the Western countries as well as also by the Chinese and so on. And the Western countries, particularly like Diego Garcia and even Trincomalee, were all bases for protection as well as for movement of trade. Then of course this led to lots of complications in terms of the aspects that broke down the linkages, and there I think Sri Lanka pushed very hard at the UN to avoid these military bases. Meant that although colonialism was over, they still had these things like Diego Garcia and so on, which were threatening their independence as well. And Sri Lanka, they have worked very hard to avoid this, and it led to what is known as the Indian Ocean Peace Zone, and the IOPZ as it's called. It was an ad hoc committee that was set up at the UN by Sri Lanka to prevent conflicts in the Indian Ocean, because there was rivalry was much earlier between the Portuguese and the British and so on, and then later the Americans also, because they were coming into the Indian Ocean. And this was a very interesting this is what was called the IOPZ. And this was interesting that this was an initiative done by one of our best ambassadors called Shirley Amarasinghe. Now Shirley Amarasinghe was earlier, he was also Secretary to the Treasury, and he was our permanent representative in the US, and I also worked with him on my first posting, and he was really an absolutely brilliant man. But of course the ad hoc committee, the Indian Ocean Committee, which was set up at Sri Lanka's initiative, had one problem, because the United States kept out of it, because they felt that also maybe part of that whole operation, and therefore they were the only countries who kept out of the Europeans. But they were the British, they also abstained and didn't get involved. But now the Indian Ocean Committee still continues, and there are 43 UN states which are members. There is no US, no UK. Both of them avoid that because they feel that that will restrict any movements, naval movements that they will have, because whatever happened in the World War, they are still not completely free, because they're a little nervous also about the rise of China and whether there might be conflicts in the Italy, Norway, among the Western countries, they are members of the ad hoc committee, which is very interesting, that meets. But and of course Russia and China also are members, and this is a committee that is now meeting every year. But quite frankly, it has also not halted some of the great power rivalry which still goes on, but not too openly, and certainly not too violently, whereas in the early days great power rivalry would mean clashes. Then of course what is interesting is that thanks to Sri Lanka, though it's a small country, the IOPZ initiative, the Indian Ocean Peace Zone initiative, also led to other vital results of the sea. Is now very clearly established type of rules on how people should control the oceans, and this is also established thanks to our permanent representative at the United Nations, Mr. Shirley Amarasinghe. For example, he was also my boss, as I said, and many UN bodies are now working on laws of the sea and good conduct of the oceans, which began this process. So at the moment now we have got about 4 committees, UN committees. One is called the Commission of the Limits on the Continental Shelf. I won't go into details, but that also provides this. Forget the exact depth. If some of its land is under and goes through, that is considered as part of its territory. For example, the Maldives has many islands, but technically the seas are not very deep. So Maldives has a very large continental shelf, because that country is like divided and kept under that. Then, very important also, the International Seabed Authority. That is also the people who look at those things and work that things out. And the last one, what is called the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea. That goes into disputes. Now, Sri Lanka, for example, has huge problems with, for example, because at the moment it's tied up also with the people in the real sense of it, the fisher folk in India and Sri Lanka. Now that is a huge problem that we are constantly dealing with, because Indian fishermen are coming into Sri Lankan waters. There is a particular border that should be there respected, but they just come in, and they are leading to a huge problem for Sri Lanka, because the fishing stocks, the fishing reserves are being very badly affected. For example, they have destroyed the fishing stocks, because what they do is that they have a thing called deep trawling, which is where the ship has, and I have seen a DVD which was done by our Navy, where they show what happens is that on the ship, as the thing is brought on, these are the larger ships, not the small Indian craft, then the big fish are kept aside and for export or for local consumption. But there are small kids, some of them 10, 15 years, they take the small fish which are fluttering like that on the boat and throw it back, which means they are destroying that stock as well, because by the time the flow goes into the water, that whole generation of fish is out. Then also, more important, the pearl banks of Sri Lanka. Now, Sri Lanka has been known in the ancient area near Jaffna and so on. Now, these are almost totally gone, because they have been all, by this deep trawling and so on, a lot of the stuff has been thrown back, and we don't have the oyster banks that we used to have in the past. And then, of course, the question of imprisonment, which both countries are caught up in very badly. Now, at the moment, I think, I don't know the statistics, but we have also arrested, obviously, Indians that come into our waters. And at different times, that has been a very tough position for foreign policy of India and Sri Lanka. And of course, very often these have been settled. And most recently also, our President Mahinda Rajapaksa, central government in India to cause problems for Sri Lanka as well. And that you can't help, because Tamil Nadu is also a very sensitive post. And of course now, with Jayalalitha being caught for a whole lot of corruption, of course she has come back now. That has been one other factor, because originally Tamil Nadu had a much stronger impact on Sri Lanka. But then that dropped, because in terms of when not Manmohan, it's when even the president came in, what happened was that although Jayalalitha had all Tamil Nadu seats except for 3, Minister of India had all these votes from other states as well. So that reduced the strength of the Tamil Nadu impact on this whole fisheries aspect. And also India investigated Jayalalitha, and she was, as you know, imprisoned, but she's back now again in Tamil Nadu. And this is one of our thorniest problems that Sri Lanka has with India, to look at all these things. But again, there are international laws which were done at the UN, but these are of course ignored, because for both central government in India and in Sri Lanka, the lives of the fishermen, what they earn, is very important. In our waters, the whole question of where is the border is the biggest problem. And earlier, Kachativu, for example, was eventually given to us. Now the Indians are challenging that and said that it is closer to the Indian borders and therefore it must be given back. So there are a whole lot of fisheries issues that are affecting the Indian Ocean, mostly affecting our relationship with India, and also in a sense with Jaffna as well, because of the whole question of our people in Jaffna having the same problem of trying to get better fishing resources from the Indian Ocean. Now I think there are, apart from the dangerous political and security issues, and this is of course tied up with what I mentioned earlier, that there are certain acts of those criminal groups, some with links even with former LTT cadres, and they are also being involved in people smuggling, visas forgeries, drug trafficking and gun running. So all those issues getting entangled quite a lot, and that is one of the problems that Sri Lanka has with India, because it corrects us very badly. Then of course what is good for Sri Lanka is that the case of travel, etc., China has Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka for bilateral relations, because they also are worried about the pirates and so on, and to that extent they have been quite good. Secondly, for the Chinese, there are contacts. The old days, the so-called Chinese routes were almost all by land. For example, a very interesting one is the Buddhist monk Fashion, who was a Chinese. Sri Lanka was well known for its Buddhism, and he actually didn't come by ship, but he came right across the land route of across China and Lanka, where he copied down lots of the Buddhist scripts. So that way the Indian Ocean has those beneficial things as well, because now also there is a lot of exchanges of that nature, but these are now very difficult to really sort of deal with in that sense. Then these really other aspects is that the China, Japan, Singapore all are quite involved in the Indian Ocean. First, they are against crime. Secondly, for their economic benefits, fisheries, all those things are there. And it is very important that these things have to be sort of worked out. But of course, with China assisting itself as well as the countries, bilateral link that we have got, then making that a transit point. Now this also has problems, for example from Mumbai, because with Hambantota developing, the problem is that for certain ships coming from China or even from Japan, it is easier to stop in Hambantota, particularly when the shipments they carry are mixed. For example, they may be carrying something from China which has cell phones and so on, or at the same time something large. Now if they keep stopping at each port, any ship from China stopping at about or Japan, which are a lot of products as well, and also delay. So what is one of the biggest advantages which the Chinese have seen is that the warehouses that will be set up across the southern coast will be an ideal place where, for example, something from Japan, which is meant for India, could be dumped there in a warehouse, and then a smaller ship, less expenses, could take it back to India. So this is another aspect. There is a sort of slight competition, but Pakistan, for example, is also helping construction and various things by in the same post, and it is developing a port in Gwadar that is continent as such, and then Bangladesh. So all three ports are being assisted by the Chinese. Of course, Bangladesh is a slightly different one because the port of Chittagong is also pays for what they call break bulk. That is where old ships are repaired in Chittagong. And sometimes when you are repairing ships, you throw away some stuff, whereas Chittagong does not really, except for some fishing, is not that much of a asset to Bangladesh. So China has really seen the values both ways of helping these countries and helping themselves as well. So that is one aspect of the whole Chinese philosophy. There are some US think tanks that have opposed China building ports and development projects, particularly in Gwadar, Hambantota, now soon Colombo also, and Chittagong. Now their fear is that this is all a plot by the Chinese to control India. In fact, that group called, and it's very interesting that this particular think tank, its name is BOOS, that's BWO. Maybe these chaps don't have a sober approach, but they have really called these forts a necklace of pearls round India. Subsequently, other Western groups have called it also a necklace of thorns. And at some think tanks I have gone to in the US, they have a slide of the Indian Ocean and they put all these ports and say, look how the Chinese are trying to control India. And their idea is that India and China are now the rising nations and Asian. And this whole question of what they call the Asian century, which is something that China is promoting very hard to show that they are coming up. And as you know, very soon China from number 2, even according to the very interesting thing. But of course, the theory is not valid. More so now as China and India are now cooperating much more. And that's a very important thing for the Indian Ocean area because they do have problems, but they also see a certain problem in the coming from the other side. That is what they call the Indo-Pacific pivot, PIVOT, that is concentration by the Americans. Now the Americans, for their own security reasons, are trying to also have greater controls and coming into the Pacific Ocean and this way as well. So that is something that is going on so that we don't affect that as well. And it was really a major problem to China as well, because when I was ambassador in China, this was one of the issues that we were discussing, the whole question of helping the building of Hambantota. And it was really a problem for India and China both. So in fact, India was a little suspicious of that. China want to show that it's purely for their own purposes and not to cause problems for India. And then because of the Indian opposition to that in the early stages, it was very interesting that we would establish a consulate of India in Hambantota, which was established. Now India has consulates are usually look after their own people. There are hardly any Indians in the south. They are certainly in the north, in Putlam, that area, and eastern and north and east. But this was bad, and it was very interesting that when I had to discuss this with the Chinese, whether they didn't mind the Indians having a consulate, so that they can observe that the Chinese development of Hambantota was not for piracy or any of the bad things like that. And then when I asked a man from the People's Liberation Army in China, setting up a Indian consulate there, it was very interesting. The man was a good joker. He said, no problem at all. We will give them free binoculars to watch what we are doing. So it was not taken seriously. But that was a very interesting thing that he worked that out. And what is interesting is that the Indian former army chief, Mr. J.J. Singh, he also laughed at the theory of the BHA, as they call it, Booth Hamilton Allen, and saying that that is nonsense, that they are not worried about that at all, and that these are purely China's things. Then, of course, there is another theory are describing this century as the Asian century. That is where development processes, diplomacy are linking up China and India and other Asian countries for mutual benefit. Where there is Asian discussions taking place to solidify Asia, not quite like the European Union, not so much, but at least to have cooperation working on that. So this whole question of the Asian century is getting wide coverage, and it is on that basis that the Chinese had their theory of the 21st century Silk Route, as they call it. That is to make it a new thing. I had, before the Portuguese came, more than one, there was the Jaffna kingdoms, and there was the Southern Kingdom, Candian Kingdom, all those were there. And it was not interference in that, but it just happened that way. Then I think sometime in June it was in June last year, the Chinese President Xi Jinping, he visited the United States, including to clarify to the Americans what is meant by the so-called Asian century that they were promoting, and also China's a serious thing, that China will beat the Americans on economic terms and become the largest economy in the world. So President Obama was quoted as informing President Xi, and these very important words also for cooperation, it is very much in the interests of the United States for China to continue its peaceful rise, because if China is successful, it helps to drive the world economy, putting China in a position to work with the United States as an equal partner, dealing with many of the global challenges that no nation can address by itself. So that was a very good of China, and that was worked out. Then also President Xi, in response to that, he indicated that in discussions with the two countries, they would, and I quote, build a new model of major country relationships. Major country relationships is their phrase, and that they could find a common path to avoid confrontation and conflict as in the past. So that whole Asian century is being given a very peaceful projection by the Chinese. Then of course, similarly, the US and India, also in September, it was in September last year, Prime should look at each other as partners of first resort and changing things. So that was very interesting that all these things are coming now as very peaceful aspects to see what the Asian century is like to be. But of course, currently, with China's growing economy and also its historic roots of economic, religious and cultural connectivity are being identified and being developed as part of the 21st century maritime Silk Route. So they are linking it up not only with economics, but also as far as possible with other aspects. And this was also rather interesting that they have Sri Lanka, for example, they have a Chinese cultural center. China are building whole lots of cultural centers all over Asia, including in the United States, where they are pushing Chinese ancient culture, not confusing it with their Chinese rise in the 21st century to become #1 state. Then it was interesting also that very early after Xi Jinping, the present president, took power, he invited Mahinda Rajapaksa to pay a state visit to China. And following that visit, China-Sri Lanka relations was also uplifted to what they call a strategic cooperative partnership. Covers trade and investment, promotion of cultural, academic and tourism links, security cooperation in combating the three evils. Now the three evils are something which China devised, which means extremism, that is violence. Secondly, separatism and terrorism. Now Sri Lanka also supports that, because what we don't want is extremism, where anyone do racial, ethnic, religious, whatever it is, wants to use extreme things. Like what the Pakistani extremists are doing it against Pakistan on the last case of this murder of these children and so on. And then terrorism. Once and tied up with separatism. Because there really the thing is that China faces also this whole question of separatism and terrorism. Again, on religious grounds rather than ethnic. They have problems in Tibet and they have problems in Xinjiang, which is basically a Muslim-oriented area. And also the ISIS, that's a group that is trying to have Islamic states all over the Middle East, also sort of were caught up in this. And it is very interesting that when Mahinda was there, and also when I was before that doing some of this work myself, and Sri Lanka had now established a joint committee on coastal and marine cooperation, which is also involved in some very, very essential things. It is going to promote surveillance or examination of all the movements on the Indian Ocean. Then ecosystem protection. That is one of the things that India is messing up by doing this deep trawling and destroying an entire ecosystem of fishing and so on. Then marine and coastal zone management, search and rescue operations, and combating piracy and people smuggling. So this is one of the decisions that was taken very early, and those to, and I quote, further intensify exchanges between their parliaments, political parties, armed forces and law authorities. So this is, I think, a very helpful thing. These have been formalized and these are going on. So that means the whole question of the so-called necklace of pearls of Bruce Hamilton is no longer considered a sort of a threat to India and the US. Then of course Sri Lanka has also launched in the Indian Ocean area what Mahinda calls the 5 hub development strategy to benefit from its central location among all the South Asian countries. It is now focusing on developing its 5 territorial occasional assets in the Indian Ocean as a maritime, aviation, commercial, energy and knowledge hub. So this is something that Mind has tried to push, but certainly the maritime hub is developing. Aviation has not been all that successful because Patala Airport is not all that successful, and it's sometimes even running at a loss. Commercial energy not all that still sort of work on slowly, but it has not sort of come out as full as that. Then what is interesting also that we have discovered or December 1st and 2nd. Now these also based on the theme of cooperation and collaboration for maritime prosperity. Now what is interesting here is that this is not purely a Sri Lankan operation, and it's an extremely good what do you call this initiative of Gotabaya. And now there are at this last one, that's the 5th Goal Dialogue. It has defense experts from 38 different countries, and they are also very important. They include now Australia, Bangladesh, China, France, India. Alphabetical list, you can get that on the website. So these are all now looking at naval problems, and they are all realizing that the Indian Ocean is the area for cooperation. At the same time, it can lead to all sorts of messy things from outside or even within the countries itself. So this is very good because I can just quickly read up a few aspects of that. The US report was very good. There is an old friend of mine who was the first secretary here in the US mission called Robert Boggs. Now he has served here, and he is now the professor of South Asian Studies at the Near East South Asia Center for Central. I was here at his last Goal conference, and he dealt with the environmental aspects, which in addition to bilateral issues also pose threats to the security to the Indian Ocean area. And therefore he called for planning, coordinated assistance and all that. And he was also referring to the tsunami, which also they say is due to certain neglect of our ocean areas and so on, which happened. And as I won't have a time on that, but it's a very interesting one, this conference where his statement is there. I'll give you his, I'll just read out. Globalization and instant, constant communication, virtually all security threats have an international dimension, which is true. Now, when they talk of constant communication, that also includes the cyber problems, and that have a whole lot of intelligence. And the Americans have discovered that some of their secret messages they do not send on the cyber now, because they can be accessed by others. And there's a very strange thing of where people using the postage for some of their reports without being sent into that area. So there are a whole lot of things in that, and it has said that, he has said, maritime domain becomes all the more important for nurturing, that is developing, inter-regional cooperation. Maritime of global warming and so on, I would have time to read all that. But he basically sort of praises what Sri Lanka has done and what has been worked out in terms of cooperation on that, particularly because the Goal Dialogue involves all those countries which I mentioned from the East and the West, and they are all working on that very hard. Then finally, on the, and also the Indians, for example, when the last Goal Dialogue took place, there was the India's National Security Advisor, Ajit Doval, and I can just quote from his keynote address to the gold thing. He said, he says that partly to establish good relations with China, maybe they are a little nervous about it, but what he says is that linkages should be used for cooperation on piracy, drug smuggling, human trafficking, and so on. So these are the things that are now accepted, and that the whole document was called Cooperation and Collaboration for Maritime Prosperity. Now, what I'll, it's yeah, that's a basic thing. There's also other aspects relating to China which are rather long. But what I'll do is, I think can easily get them on the internet, and that will fill in all the gaps. So having said that, we have some time for any questions that need to be asked. So floor is open.